Going on now until September 10th at noon, we are running a free giveaway of our Movement Foundations course and exercise database. Visit our Instagram account, Resilient PPT, to learn more and enter. If you've already purchased these prizes, we'll get you our next course or provide a future discount of the same value. Either way, we'll make it work so you can benefit as well. Hope to see you there. Before today's episode, I want to ask for your interest. We'd like to open our Keep It Real episodes up to you, the listener, and have discussions on topics driven by the content of this podcast and our social media. If you're interested, we'd love to hear so by dropping us a message on our Instagram. Our handle is ResilientPPT, ResilientPPT. Thanks.
Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by William Wayland. William is a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the National Strength and Conditioning Association. He works in Essex, United Kingdom, where he is responsible for the preparation of UFC fighters, professional boxers, world champion grappling athletes, and professional golfers. If any of you follow William's work on social media, you'll see that he's been posting a lot about his work with golfers. He has videos of some of his professional golfers doing hand-supported split squats with 500 pounds with good form, and been following his work for a while, and I've been intrigued by his approach to golf preparation because it's a little bit different than what you typically see. I think we all, when we envision training for golf in the gym, it tends to conjure up images of more physical therapy-based training. Most of the movements tend to be rotational in nature, and William, as he talks about in this podcast, likes to train his golfers more like vertical power athletes. And I was interested in hearing his rationale for that. He gets into great depth about that rationale and also about some of the key performance indicators in golf and how strength and conditioning coaches can actually influence those KPIs. William, thank you so much for coming on. So I wanted to begin by asking you about your strength and conditioning practice. I know I began following your work through your work with MMA athletes, and you've since kind of transitioned to golf. I've enjoyed your insight into training both populations. So how did you gravitate towards working with these populations, or how did they gravitate towards working with you?
Yeah, so for the past 7 years, I've been operating as a private S&C coach in Chelmsford in the UK, and for the past near 3.5 years, I've been operating in a private facility there as well. And the transition to MMA to golf came sort of as a consequence of the types of help this population needs. And basically, I had MMA fighters who were seeing physios. And those same physios also see a lot of golfers, because golf is obviously, an injury-prone population. So are fighters, and the same physios started then referring me golfers. And then you do a good job, and then those people refer to other people, and then you build a network, and that reputation grows, and you get more and more clients eventually as it works in private practice. And I did a good enough job that some of these physios were impressed enough that I got then referred to PGA European Tour, and then started working with them as a consultant. So that's kind of the testament to incrementally doing a good job, I guess. And that's how I sort of started working with both those populations at once. And then some of the MMA stuff sort of died down a little bit, and then more recently it's picked back up again. Everything ebbs and flows anyway. And now I'm in a position where I've worked with the UFC fighters in the past, and I'm working with a few now. Corey McKenna recently, got contracted to the UFC, which is terrific. So I've worked with Arnold Allen now for a very long time, probably 8 years we've been working together. So both of those athletes are good examples of long-term, athletic development athletes. I've worked with Corey since she was 15. She's 21 now. I've worked with Arnold since his late teens, early 20s. And they're both now, Arnold's top 10 He's ranked number 10 in his division, and Corey's now looking at a path ahead of her in the UFC. And you know, I like working with both populations of golfers and fighters. You know, someone made a joke recently that I'm only any good working with athletes that try and hit things hard. So, you know, which is fine with me.
All right. And then now, whether it's with the golfers or the MMA fighters, are they working out at your facility? Are you traveling with them to tournaments and fights, or both?
Yeah. So at the moment, because of the way MMA works, most of these guys, the UK at the moment is bereft of like decent training camps for MMA guys. So a lot of guys go to where the talent is concentrated. So for instance, Arnold trains out in Canada, in Montreal with Faris Sahabi. And then Corey, for instance, trains in Team Alpha Male with Uriah Faber. And then other fighters, you know, the more ones fighting on lower level shows are more local to me, so I can work with them one-to-one more regularly. And the others, it's mainly via correspondence, or when they come back here, we'll do sort of intensification periods where obviously they can get in with me, do quality work, and then while they're away, they train via correspondence. And that system works pretty well. And with the golfers, obviously you're working with a touring athlete. There'll be periods during the winter maybe where they can come see me for a month or so. The golf off season is pretty short. So if they're playing like a lot of events a year, I don't get to see them very often. So again, that's all via correspondence. And then the work I do on tour means that I'll travel out to the tour, wherever the event is, be it in Dubai or somewhere like that, or maybe in and around Europe. I'll travel there, work for a few days, you know, doing whatever they need. And I'm available to any of the tour players at that point in time, not just the guys I work with. And, you know, that work varies enormously in terms of scope. And then I'll come back home. So, you know, it's sort of when things are normal, I'm traveling a good fair bit of the year. And then the rest of the time I'm based in my gym.
Okay. Yeah. And I want to focus the discussion today on golf. And I'll begin by asking what might seem like an obvious question, but, you know, as coaches and physios, we like to believe that the things that we do help athletes, but there's also the naive interventionism effect where we can actually do things that make them worse. So, you know, for you, what are some of the key KPIs, you know, performance indicators in golf, and how can you as a strength coach actually influence those things so that you're actually presumably making them better at golf and not just having them kill time in a weight room?
Yeah. So a lot of credit goes to my colleagues on the European tour, two people in particular, Simon Briley and Dan Coughlin, who are my colleagues, and they put together a probability of impact pyramid. That you can find that online, and the probability of impact pyramid that they invented, basically from top to bottom, the greatest impact we can have as S&C coaches up to the least impact, the things we least affect. Obviously, the greatest amount of impact we have is on injury prevention. The majority of golf injuries, like I think it's nearly 80%, are overuse injuries. And, you know, literature states that we can reduce that by 50%. I certainly see it in my practice that the stronger golfers are the ones who are inherently less hurt and, you know, therefore have greater availability to practice. Next up is clubhead speed, which is obviously very, very in vogue at the moment with what's going on with, say, Bryson DeChambeau, athletes like that who've obtained a lot of clubhead speed via, you know, through S&C interventions during lockdown period, and also gained a lot of body mass. And how this has impacted his clubhead speed, and a lot of athletes are interested in that now. And then for the very top of this pyramid is the influence on you know, technical execution. It's obviously much smaller, and the outcomes are somewhat unpredictable. So like I'll occasionally give interventions where we focus on speed work. Say, like for instance, I had a conversation with an athlete the other day, and I said, you know, let's take maybe 20% of your total drives that you're practicing, and let's practice those with maximum intent. No technical input on my part, just go out, practice 20% of those drives. So looking at it more from a physical perspective. And, you know, he may see some acute clubhead speed improvements, but I can't be that sure that I'll have that much of an impact. What I'm trying to do there is train intent again. So the only impact we really have on technical outcomes are, say, if the athlete's not hurt, they can practice more, so they can practice their technique more. But that's the realm of the golf coach, and that's where a lot of collaboration is needed. But yeah, in terms of the broader sense, injury prevention is number one, and then clubhead speed is number two, and then, you know, the technical stuff, who knows? It's very hard to say if we're having any real influence.
Yeah, and one of the debates that always comes up in any sport and with regard to the utility and effectiveness of strength coaches is this whole specificity concept. And you had a tweetorial that I'm going to post in the show notes with, kind of your philosophy on golf training. And one of the statements that you made was trying to emulate on-field movements in the gym never ends. So where you can just take it too far, where you chase specificity to the point that maybe it actually is not addressing some of the KPIs that you just mentioned. And you also said that if you're training golfers like a vertical power athlete, you're 80% of the way there. So can you elaborate on that? Because that runs counter to what a lot of people in the golf training and fitness world are saying, which is like, it's much more, in my opinion, kind of like physio driven and specificity driven. And you don't see really much work in the sagittal plane at all. And you're emphasizing sagittal plane movements, maximal strength, rate of force development in the sagittal plane. So how did you kind of come to that conclusion?
Yeah, so I guess it's a case of the biggest thing is I walked so once I started working with golf S&C, my first thing to do is reverse engineer the sport and take a look at what's actually happening from a technical and physical perspective. And what was weird is more golfers are clamoring for distance. So they really, really keen on distance. All the evidence shows that if you're hitting it more than 300 yards, you're going to earn a lot more money than the guys who aren't. So, prize money is super important. Well, what are the correlates to high club head speed? Well, all the evidence is currently suggesting that if you've got a really high isometric mid-thigh pull and you've got a good counter movement jump, those two things correlate to high club head speed. Well, what's the prerequisite for that? Well, those are both vertical measures, not rotational measures. So it makes sense that we then, working backwards, we need to put more vertical force emphasis into our training. Again, these are correlative, so we can't be totally sure. But then what happens is we obviously introduce a training intervention. We improve vertical force production, club head speed goes up, players are hitting it further, they're winning more prize money. So we're basically, reverse engineering and then working our way back up to the outcome again. And obviously, if the outcome's positive, then we're in a great situation because, we know it's not working if they're not improving club head speed. What I've said before is that if you're getting stronger, club head speed keeps improving. We're on the right path. But if you're getting strong and club head speed's not moving anywhere, there's obviously a technical or tactical, intervention that's needed.
Yeah, and you kind of make the point in your book that it just came out, or is about to come out, the Big Hitters Manual, that, the technical practice involves a bunch of rotation and work outside the sagittal plane. And so your thing is, and my thing a lot of times is, as a strength coach, what can you give the athlete that they don't have, they're not getting in their sport? And sometimes being as unspecific as possible, at least in terms of, maybe the plane of movement or like the biomechanical patterns might actually be the most helpful to their sport. And you reference some insight that you gained from other rotational sports like javelin and baseball. So and even MMA when it comes to striking, how did those rotational sports and kind of your study of those sports influence kind of your thought process when it comes to golf? Because there are some similarities.
So obviously the biggest one being baseball, because recently I've worked together with Terrence Kennel, who works at Houston Astros, and we've collaborated a lot just recently. So, the study of the baseball hitter, something we both learned is that as we got our athletes stronger, club head speed went up. In baseball, as they get stronger, exit velocity on batting goes up. So, the fact that those two commonalities exist between the two sports, the athlete keep getting stronger, exit velocity, club head speed, both keep going up. There's obviously a strong relationship between those two things. And then the other thing that relates pretty well is body mass. So, those javelin's a bit different because obviously you get a running start, but it seems that obviously the ability to apply force, particularly when you've got a long duration of time. And this is the other thing that factors in that people don't consider. People think golf's a very fast sport. And yes, if you look at the instant the club hits the ball, the club is moving at an incredible speed. But the overall movement of the golf swing is actually slow in a sporting sense. The wind up and then release, I think it's 0.8 to nearly 1.2 seconds, which in a sports context is an absolute age. People cite that oft, 0.2 seconds for sort of sporting action in, say, a field sport. So 0.2, sorry. You know, that's the gold standard. Well, some sports, that's not the case. They've got more time to actually recruit force production. So in golf is an excellent example. You watch the swing, yeah, the club is going back. You watch what the low body's doing, effectively they're doing almost a quarter squat, and they've got plenty of time to do it. So all that downward force then provides them excellent anchorage in order to produce a lot of rotational force. You know, the old adage that you can't shoot a cannon from a canoe is true here, you know, and that's the case. And the thing is, it's almost like in golf, they've been focusing so much so on the swing mechanics, they're almost missing the broader holistic physicality that goes into the swing. So they almost put the cart before the horse, which is, you know, which is well-meaning, because if you go in and you think, well, obviously we're looking to optimize swing mechanics, then what we need to do is load elements of the swing, which is the sort of simplistic approach. Well, you know, we know that, you know, you've got to be a little bit more reductive than that and take that back a step further. And the saying I like is that basically a lot of golf, when I first started working with a lot more golf, I noticed that their practice was very optimization focused. So they were looking at completely trying to optimize the system. You know, the TPI system is based around fixing swing faults as they see them, and which I don't fully agree with, because I think swinging is a highly idiosyncratic activity. Not every golfer looks alike. So fixing faults can always be very problematic, because you're trying to fix idiosyncrasies, which isn't fair. And by being totally optimization focused, if we think of it in terms of, say, a Pareto principle, you know, 80% of your results, you know, it's an 80-20 split almost is the way I try and describe it. So, you know, a lot of golfers are missing that 80% of their raw physicality. That 20% optimization, which we get from, say, swing strategies, including, you know, speed swinging, stuff like that, that needs that 80% of you know, physicality. Or another way we could describe it is like the dumbbell strategy or the barbell strategy. You need to put most of your time in low risk interventions. Let's call that your meat and potatoes type training. And then that last 20% is your optimization strategies. That's when you need to worry about fault finding and stuff like that. But what they do is in golf S&C, for the most part, golf fitness, they've almost flipped it over, where they think the majority of focus, 80% of your time, needs to be spent on that optimization, or what they call optimization, which in fact for a lot of the time is just messing about. You know, which is, you see it, and golfers are pillared quite a lot online, because you see a lot of their strength and conditioning interventions, and it's basically just trying to replicate swing mechanics in various fashions with various loads with various different toys, and it really gets people nowhere.
Yeah, and I think that you make the point in the book that it's not that stuff is bad, but it's already going on with the swing coach. And as a strength coach, like, your tools are tools that allow you to externally load that system, which is something that you can't get on the golf course with a swing coach. And you're not training that vertical component or overloading it, you know, on the course like you can in a weight room or in a more detached sort of a setting. And so you've mentioned that, like, developing this vertical power can help with clubhead speed. You also talk about in the book, which I think was interesting, because we always hear about the concept of speed reserve in the context of field sports, right? So you increase your maximal velocity, it improves your repeat sprintability, your speed endurance. It's not that it's a unique concept, but can you talk about clubhead speed reserve in the context of, you know, playing in a tournament where, you know, the more you develop that, now if you're swinging in a match in a series of more submaximal swings, how it makes those swings kind of more efficient?
So this is where the concept is that you're practicing your swinging at the highest velocities you can physically achieve. And by raising that ceiling of your swing, so let's say you start, your max swing is 130, which is fast. That's pretty fast for anybody. Now, your average swings are maybe 115, 112, because your accuracy is going to be higher at that lower speed. What we want, if you want to hit it further, is you're going to have to be connecting with the ball at 100, 120, maybe 130 miles per hour, but with that higher degree of accuracy. Well, where do you find that? And obviously, what we look to get athletes doing is they start swinging at maximum velocities, and we try and bring that up, bring that ceiling up. the average velocity then comes up. So if you can hit the ball at 150, 160 miles per hour when you're absolutely all out going for it, we're not saying that when you're playing, you have to swing at that speed. But what happens is your average velocity comes up. So your average swing speed, if you're hitting at 100, if you're able to hit at 150, your average swing, becomes an effortless 130 mile per hour swing. And that's where the money is, because if you can hit at 130 miles per hour, you're still hitting an exceptional distance. We're not saying that when you're on the ball, you'll be hitting at 150, 160. You're not a long drive guy. Those guys don't care where the ball goes. You at least want some control over where the ball goes. So if your average swings are that much higher because your ability, your top end capacity is way, way higher, swinging at 120, 130 is going to be a lot easier. So it's that idea of raising the ceiling. But that raising the ceiling can only be done when you've brought the floor up, so to speak. So you need to have that broad base of general physicality in order to support that optimization of maximum swing speed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and then is there any data that you're aware of about what some of the top players on tour, like what their max club head speed is? Not what they're doing, in a tournament, but separate from that.
Yeah, so we have our normative scores that we have. So, for instance, very, very top percentile would be 125 miles per hour. We would consider, you in the top 10% of players. And then probably some of the slowest speeds are down to like 115, 112, which is kind of on the slower side. So there's, and the argument is that I think it's 1 mile per hour is roughly 3 yards distance. So, you think about it, that's a difference in sort of, up to 30 yards, which can make a lot of difference when it comes to playing for a lot of cash money. So, it's you want that extra distance. If you can gain strokes off tee, that's a massive game changer for you. So, that's why it's important for these guys to look to optimize their club head speed. Now, there are guys who hit it short and can still recover from that. But all the golfers I talk to, they're like, I'd rather hit it further, have to hit it out of the rough than hit it shorter and have it on the fairway. So, because the closer you are to the tee, the better. And they're more willing to deal with that variance that comes from hitting it further than hit it shorter and have to potentially make up more shots. So, it's a game of where you want to apply risk, really. And that's what hitting it further does for you. It literally gives you more tactical options. And that's the way we've been trying to sell it to a lot of golfers, because some of them are really still very much worried that gaining mass or gaining strength will affect their swing somehow.
Yeah, and you mentioned, trying to strive for like 140, 150, raising the ceiling to that. Mm-hmm. How, in your experience, like how attainable is that with the right training?
Again, you've got to have all the right pieces in place. There are some athletes that with no physical training are capable of very high club head speeds. These guys are very lucky. Either they've got high technical, really high technical ability, or they're naturally quite athletic and they're able to merge those two things together. And then I'm always careful. I never promise people more club head speed. I always say we might be able to. So I'm very careful with the language I use because I can't guarantee anything.
Sure. But
we do obviously always say, well, the majority of this population, for a start, let me be clear, is pretty undertrained. So we always generally see an improvement with most reasonable strength and conditioning interventions. It's the players who've been doing perhaps the more swing-specific interventions that are a little bit disillusioned because they've been trying to apply these very sport-specific approaches in the gym and wherever. They see no club head speed improvement, so then they start asking questions, and it's like, well, maybe I should do more general physical training. That the realization sometimes comes to them themselves. So, it's a case of just being very, very careful. But I've seen anywhere from people gaining, for instance, I had a case the other day, after 3 sessions, and a slight modification. And the biggest thing I gave them to take away was intent. So you go out there and you hit the ball as hard as you physically can for 20% of your shots. They went from 112 to 125 in 3 sessions. And the difference was, they didn't get stronger, did they? The difference was they were attacking with intent. They were going after, they were actually trying to put more effort into what they were doing. Because one of the, I guess, classically with golf, it's all about having a smooth, natural swing. their golf coach never generally goes out there and tells them to absolutely try and murder the ball. And
Right.
that's the one change we made. It was to say, like, go out there and try and absolutely kill it. You know, that's an extreme example. But with good physical training, we see anywhere, you know, within an intervention, sort of few mile per hour after a couple of months of training to significant changes, sort of 10 mile per hour. But it varies. It's very idiosyncratic. So it depends on the individual. It depends on their training status. But generally, you know, if we test them and their mid-thigh pull's weak and their counter movement jump is poor, we can pretty much, you know, not guarantee, but come close to it, that getting stronger is probably going to make it have some significant impact potential on your club head speed. But again, we're always careful with what we suggest we're capable of, because again, we're not so arrogant as to say, well, we're not entirely sure what the outcome will be.
Yeah, and based on what you're saying, it seems that you're not trying to tweak with the mechanics of people's golfer swings, but more so like the intent in trying to train the physicality of it. Now, I'm guessing that these are technical coaches that you work with and have a good relationship with. Have you ever gotten any pushback from a technical coach that you're like, hey, you're messing with this guy's swing, I don't want you telling him to swing hard? Or is it the kind of thing where you're collaborating before you give that recommendation off the golf course?
Yeah, generally. So golf is weird in that most of the time, most of the athletes I'm working with, their coaches, they see them occasionally, and their coaches aren't constantly with them. So golf is unique in that regard. You know, if you're working in a team sport, everything has to be bounced off the coach, right? Or the coach wants some involvement. In golf, they're more independent. So they don't actually have a ton of, you know, constant intervention via the coach. Now, there are some athletes where that's different. The coach will actively play a big role in coming to tournaments with them and stuff like that. And on the whole, for the most part, the up and coming guys who I generally get to work with are they're very pragmatic, and they're quite pro, you know, interventions that could potentially get them more club head speed. I guess it would say it'd be the more established athletes that have been doing it a certain way for a long time, where they and their coach they're hesitant. So you have to put more work into trying convincing them. This is where objective data, because golfers love information, they love data, they love numbers. So they're very numbers driven athletes, which is great, because if you get them in and do some physical testing and say, well, you know, you pulled this on your mid-thigh pull, this is where the upper percentile is, this is where you need to be, instantly they'll go, well, I need to work on that then, you know. And by giving them that objective information, you know, because they're so used to dealing with club head speed, yardages, strokes gains, you know, golf is a statistics playground if you want to dig into it deep. And those guys like numbers. So if you can give them objective numbers-based stuff, you know, rather than perhaps more sort of more subjective-oriented stuff, which is quite a lot of what they get already from a lot of their physical training. It's quite subjective in nature. So by giving them some objectivity, something numbers oriented, they sometimes actually latch onto that and quite like the idea that they're trying to boost numbers or do it that way. So, which I didn't expect. I expect them to be very much about sort of feel oriented and very subjective when it comes to the way their physical training goes. And obviously, as you progress with physical training, it does become more nuanced in that way. But a lot of them, I think they're just tired of being sort of dealt with almost like kid gloves when it comes to the physical training element. You know, some of them are actually aware that robustness and that physicality is a big part of what they need. But for the most part, most coaches, yeah, I've never really had a lot of pushback. Only sometimes, you know, it's the more old school guys, you know, that are less into that type of stuff. And you still see bits and pieces online. But the worst people for the detractors for that type of thing are the commentary and pundits. And, you know, commentators on Twitter and Instagram, they're the ones who seem to have a real problem with it.
Yeah.
You know, because golf is just one thing. Golf is weird because it's quite a popular recreational sport, and it's one of the few sports where pros and amateurs actually get to play together from time to time. Yeah. You know, the pro-am in golf is such a weird thing. I still can't get my head around it. Like, imagine any other sport where you got to play as an amateur with other professionals, you know, at a tournament event. That doesn't happen in any other sport. Like, so, you know, it's weird because a lot of the pushback, I guess, comes from recreational guys who are just focusing on improving their swing and not really worried about too much else.
Yeah, and I think you've made a good case that, you know, this vertical power training does have, you know, a transfer to club head speed and to golf performance. And as we talked about, specificity is not this linear thing. There's second order effects, there's tangential effects. But you also, in one of your, you know, your tweets, you said, You cannot optimize a system that is not robust to make a case for strength training. So even if we can't objectively prove transfer, you're saying that there is a place for strength training in terms of like overall robustness. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think that and Mladen talks about this in his book, I think there's reasons to strength train, even if you can't objectively prove that it quote unquote transfers.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the sell on this and talk about robustness, I guess is injury minimization, or I don't like the word prevention, because that's a misnomer. So in terms of building a robust system, and again, we know in golf that overuse injury is the most prevalent one. Again, going back to that 80% number, if we can mitigate that by just making a person more robust, and that's where a lot of it seems to come from. We know that low back, wrist, shoulder seem to be the most common injury points. A lot of people talk to me about how do I deal with golfers that are injured. I'm very fortunate because of the type of training I try and employ. We get very few injuries. It's only when someone tries to make a technical intervention and a golfer is doing something in their swing, we get a tissue overload, and then that causes a problem. But for the most part, it's by making them robust in a general physical sense. So just being strong, whatever that means, and in my case, it's generally having them hands-on with barbell work, conventional barbell work, and a lot of people will eye roll and go, well, that's kind of obvious. I said, well, if it's obvious, then why aren't people doing it? And I dislike the number, but like, can they double body weight squat? Can they one and a half times body weight squat, if that? Can they pull twice their body weight on a trap bar? Can they bench press 1.25 times their body weight? These aren't unreasonable numbers, but they're numbers that will definitely give them a sense of physical empowerment, robustness, because that plays a big role as well. An athlete feels strong, they're more likely to then take on greater tasks, whereas if you treat them like they're fragile all the time, their sense of self becomes corrupted by this idea that they're weak and they're potentially damageable. So they perhaps limit their practice, they won't chase intent, but when you feel strong, when you feel powerful, you're going to chase that intent because you're like, this is in my scope. I'm trying to optimize myself here. And that's a big part of it too. So I notice when athletes do feel strong, they do feel powerful, they feel robust, intent-based and optimization-based strategies suddenly become something that's attainable, and they see it almost like sharpening a sword, and that's difficult to do if you don't have that background of robustness. And this is where golf, I think, a lot of times gets it wrong. It's always focused on optimization first. And you, like I said, you can't optimize a system that isn't robust. And that's what a lot of golf S&C consists of at the moment, is just trying to optimize systems that aren't robust. But all I'm doing is offering them that handle, a little bit more robustness, a little bit more injury proof, so to speak. And then once you've got all that in hand, then you can chase your optimization strategies, whatever they look like.
Yeah. And I think that, like on the surface, it makes sense. Like, yes, most people, especially who are undertrained, would benefit from some kind of strength training. The natural question that arises after that is, well, what is strong enough in the context of golf training? You kind of alluded to it a little bit. I think an analogy is like a bank account, right? Like if you only have enough money in the bank account to pay for your daily expenses, it makes daily living pretty expensive, right? You're operating at like 100% of your sort of expenditure capacity. Having money in the bank makes the cost of the performance less expensive, but then you don't need to have $1 billion in the bank either. So for you and in your system, what do you consider what are your benchmarks that you consider strong enough? And kind of related to that, how much work outside of the sagittal plane in the weight room do you think is necessary beyond what the sport provides?
So again, this is an issue of where are they currently? Because obviously, again, idiosyncrasy always turns up to mess things up for you. Athletes are, especially it's certain athletes, based on leverages, particularly a sport like golf that favors certain body types. You have to be careful where you are placing the dominance in your training. And what I've found for the most part is that the ceiling on that relationship between strength and performance outcomes in golf, we don't really know where it is. We've not found it yet because no one's really explored it thoroughly. we're learning more. So we know that high levels of mid-thigh pull, have high correlate to clubhead speed. Alex Elhert has done some great stuff summarizing research showing, where the highest level of correlates sit in terms of most, and that vertical force one is a massive one. Body mass is the other one. And then there's some upper body stuff in there as well that seems to correlate pretty well. And for me, it's a case of, and I argued this on another podcast with Jay DeMeo, and I was saying to him how, well, when we're performing our intervention, because we don't really know where the ceiling sits, what we look for, if the athlete's getting stronger and the clubhead speed keeps improving, we're on the right path. If we keep strength training hard and the clubhead speed, it suddenly stops moving or isn't going anywhere, we can probably step away a little bit. That's not the intervention we need anymore. That's where we need perhaps special strength or speed-based interventions. And because it seems that heavy physical training is something that's not really been fully explored. It's nice being in a sport where I'm still exploring that stuff and seeing where the ceiling sits, and having athletes that work with me that are willing to explore that too. They're not timid. So, if I'm trying to get them to a triple bodyweight trap bar deadlift, they're like, they don't think that's unreasonable, but it's taken time to build that relationship where they have the confidence to perhaps chase numbers like that. My strongest swingers now, have 2.5 time bodyweight trap bar deadlifts. Some of them in deadlift similar to that, which I guess most golfers would consider outrageous. And for a lot of my golf clients, particularly the ones that are very busy, I would consider that too high. But, it's a case of still exploring, well, where does the optimal relationship sit? And this is, again, coming back to my discussion with Terrence Kennel at Houston Astros. He was saying, we got guys trap bar deadlifting nearly triple body weight, and their exit velocities still keep getting better. Well, it's like, well, maybe in these sports where the completion sequence is long, much like hammer, much like shot put, those guys are outrageously strong, right? Some of the strongest athletes I've ever seen are hammer throwers, and their time to completion and technique is quite long, and it bears probably more similarity to golf and baseball than it does to other sports. And I can't remember who said it. It may have been Al Vermeil who said, it's worth training golfers like throwers, because the commonalities are more similar than they are different, and I make this same point in the Big Hitters Manual that the reason this manual exists, one that I've written for both golf and baseball, is that the majority of the work they need to do is more similar than it is different. And again, we're exploring, we're still trying to find out where the optimal place sits for most golfers to get strong. And again, because it's kind of untapped, we still don't really know. So it's kind of an ongoing process. I know it's a very long-winded answer to that question. But,
I appreciate the honesty, and I mean, you're using the KPI that you care about, which is clubhead speed, to kind of dictate whether you think that what you're doing is working, which I think is very reasonable. Not in the off season when there aren't as many confounding factors. How many days a week do you have your golfers in the gym lifting?
Because they practice so regularly, it's usually maybe only 3 days a week lifting. Some will switch to 4, upper body push pull or something. But usually it's roughly 3 days per week, not much more than that. A few guys will demand more, and again, that's where again idiosyncrasy slips in. Some guys like to train every day. Some guys don't like to train every day. The biggest switch up though is that when it comes to in season, I'm very, very hands-on with how we try and control load and volume during in season, because in golf in season is hard, and a lot of people don't appreciate that how hard it is trying to balance everything together. So yeah, when it comes to in season, maybe 2 days a week. Some of them want to train more, but usually 2, and then off season it's usually 3, because these guys practice non-stop and they hit a lot of balls. I think I mentioned the problem with them not monitoring volumes on on how many balls they hit is also a massive issue as well. I think I mentioned that in the Big Hitters Manual too, about how volume is something that people don't track, but it's such an easy thing to track in terms of ball volume. And if you can do that, you've got a handle on how you're loading yourself physically. And a lot of guys don't do that at all. And it's like, well, if you want your physical training to work alongside your golf practice, you need to monitor volumes. You're monitoring your training volume in the gym. Why aren't you monitoring your volume on the range? So that's a big factor as well.
In your experience, is there a point or a volume of, number of balls hit on the course that you think where it's diminishing returns, whether it's like, weekly, daily? For a pitcher, it's kind of like 100 pitches is like sort of the magic number where you start to be like, all right, I've got to pull this person. Is there any kind of a similar type number, whether it's, weekly or daily that you look out for?
So it's funny, I was talking to Terrence as well. Something he said is pitchers really carefully monitor their throwing volumes because of the injury risk. In baseball, not at all. They'll get into the batting cage and just keep hitting balls. So and they don't really record the volumes. It seems to be the same thing as in golf. And there was some research done. I think it was a piece of PhD research done by England Golf, where they were basically sending out surveys to coaches and athletes, trying to figure out how many balls, what ball volumes were. It was either per month or per week. And I spoke at a conference maybe 3-4 years ago, and they presented this data, and basically it was all over the place. Some people were hitting 100 balls, some people were hitting thousands of balls, and it's like, we don't know what the optimal volume is. Again, because nobody's really taking the time to look into this stuff. It's the same.
Which is crazy, right? Yeah.
It makes no sense. So this is where it's such a simple thing to take ownership of that people aren't. It boggles my mind. Like, why, a sport that prizes numbers so highly doesn't do that in its practice. It's such a strange disconnect. So it's like, well, maybe if we did start monitoring volumes, we can control for load, because most of what I've seen on an anecdotal level is that when obviously there's an introduction of a new technique, the athlete's keen to perhaps try out some new technical change, they'll go hit more balls than they normally do. Yeah. Again, the tissue overload problem then becomes a problem. And it's like, you've got to carefully monitor what you're loading and when and what changes you're making and why. But a lot of people don't monitor that stuff, So it's just, that's perhaps an influence as an S&C coach I can have on the technical practice, is to say, hey, maybe you need to monitor a little bit more, because golfers, they treat it a lot like an art. And I guess that's where they lack perhaps objectivity to some extent, because the objectivity comes from when they play, because it's so numbers oriented. When they're practicing, they perhaps don't do the same thing.
Yeah. And it's funny because if you look at other sports like running, right? I mean, for a distance runner, weekly mileage, like every distance runner knows their weekly mileage, and it's not the only metric that they should track, but at least they're aware of it. It's a starting point. And you have sports like golf or baseball where outside of like pitching, no one's keeping track of the number of, rotations, whether it's with a golf club or a baseball bat. And the issue that you kind of brought up is if a golfer increases his or her, swing volume, so to speak, because they're working on what a coach identifies as a technical fault, and at the same time they're starting like a lifting program and they get like a back injury, no one's going to look at the golf swinging and say that was the cause of the injury. They're going to say, oh, this guy started lifting, now we shouldn't lift anymore. So it's important to track these things so you can draw the right conclusions and not blame, the wrong culprit for, injuries that do arise.
And false attribution is a problem in golf. It happens quite a lot. You may recall Tiger coming out recently saying that he blamed some of his injuries in retrospect, perhaps on the fact he was trying to run like 5 miles a day, and it's like, things like that, like people don't account for. And S&C is always going to get thrown under the bus, particularly if there's a lack of understanding. It's easy to go, well, it was the S&C program, not the technical changes or whatever that people make. So it becomes the poor relation in that regard. Whereas, as we know, ideally it's all integrated. You want to be holistic about the whole thing, but it's too easy just to go, well, this novel practice is what's caused the problem, let's ditch it, and then that's part of the risk.
Yeah, blame the deadlifts. Now, you talked about, there is a point where if club head speed plateaus and people are still, gaining strength, you might say, okay, now it's time to do some more special strength work. So what does that look like in the context of golf conceptually, or like a practical example for you?
Yeah. So in this case, it's where, that's where we start then thinking, well, maybe we can start moving out of the sagittal plane and into transverse and lateral. So that's when we start looking at optimizing torso and the relationship between that's where we go, well, we've improved vertical force production. How do we then transfer that into lateral? Well, what's the easiest tool we can use for that? So for instance, med ball throws are an easy intervention, because that way you get foot to hand coordination. And I do the same thing with fighters. So I'll look to optimize, throwing, and we'll do various types of throws, both extensive and intensive throwing. at various volumes depending on the athlete's capacity. Usually, if they've not done a lot of med ball work, we build slow and then build up to sort of moderately high volume. Something that surprised me talking to Al Vermeil, who worked with a lot of golfers during the 90s. He was saying he wished he'd been more aggressive with the loading, with the med ball work. I think they, again, that mentality of treating them like they're fragile, and doing a lot of more throws with those guys. So we start doing a lot of, and light med ball throws as well. We're not talking very heavy, maybe 2 pounds, not much more than that. And we're not, again, looking to replicate the golf swing. It's a throw in the rawest sense. So like shot put type throws, med ball style sort of punch throws, and then sort of lateral swings. And then what we look to do is then specialize some of the low body mechanics. So we'll look to block the lead leg and internally rotate through the front hip, from the lead side, which is what happens in a golf swing. And that's about as specific as we get. We don't look to replicate the swing per se, but we just look at some of the ground mechanics, trail leg, lead leg, what are they doing? How can we optimize that? And then have them throw a med ball as hard as they can in conjunction with that. And then if we're then looking to specialize further, so I posted a few videos where I show like a progression sequence of like vertical force production, med ball throw into speed swing. And we'll use that as a complex or contrast type training. And then the last thing is usually a speed swing where it's full sports mechanics. I don't do any technical coaching. The athlete knows exactly what to do, and they'll swing a lightened club as fast as they can for the overspeed benefits they're chasing. And we'll use that as a triple set or something where they'll do a jump, they'll do a throw, and then they'll do a swing. So we get that ascending dynamic correspondence. It gets closer and closer to the sport. And then particularly, if we're looking to pick them for an event, we'll do more of that speed swinging type work.
Very cool. And then you also talk a lot in the book about the importance of muscle mass for clubhead speed. Is that something where you're having golfers chase a specific goal? Like, I want, this person to gain 10 pounds. You just kind of let the training and nutrition, sound training and nutrition is going to lead them to the right place, kind of a thing. Yeah.
It's kind of, we let that one lead itself. We don't give them a set weight to gain. Again, these are guys that are, again, highly numbers oriented. So we're very careful what we give them to achieve. And, especially when Bryson went out and gained so much body mass, I think it was like 30 pounds or something over 6 months. And I'm like, that's perhaps a little bit too lofty, so these guys are, because they're so peer interested, they'll follow their peers as to what they do. So if Bryson gains 30 pounds, people will go, well, I'll get on 6,000 calorie shakes a day as well and see what happens. And for some people, obviously that isn't the correct avenue to go down, but they're very much, they'll follow each other about, if someone's doing X, then I'll have to do X, and we kind of let it take care of itself. What I do is make sure that adiposity doesn't get too high. So, that's either just a look in the mirror, or we'll check their body weight and make sure they're not gaining too much mass too fast. So if it's past like a sort of normal amount, if they're gaining more than maybe a kilo a month, that's pretty quick. Weight gain, substantial muscle gain, quality weight gain takes slow, and you've got to educate them that that's a slow process, and it's going to take a few years of work. You look at one of the golfers I work with who's gone from like weighing something in the high 70s is now in the low 90s. That's a process of 3 years. So that's probably about 3 to 4 kilo of lean muscle mass a year, and his body fat hasn't changed very much. So that's slow, but people aren't ready for that type of slow muscle gain. And, maybe with some newbies, particularly if they're under eating, they suddenly end up in a calorific excess. They're doing some hypertrophy type work. They suddenly gain a lot of mass suddenly, but that's because they're kind of super compensating against the state they were in previously. And some of them do undereat. The nutrition on course and nutrition in golf is often not the best.
Okay. And you also write about the conflation of physio with golf training and golf fitness. Now they've kind of become synonymous. And you've written extensively about where you think the role for a physio and strength coach, what should be delineated as far as the responsibilities. So, and I want you to be totally honest as a physio, because, physios tend to be obsessed with biomechanics. Mm-hmm. I've been guilty of that. And golf is a very biomechanically driven sport. And it's one of those things where, as the more you look, the easier it is to find faults. And there's always something you could be chasing, which creates endless job security for a physio. But there's a downside to that. So can you talk about like, what do you think the role as a physio, the role of strength and conditioning, and then kind of how they can work together to maximize the potential of the athlete?
Yeah, so you said it, I didn't say it, so I'm glad about that. So yeah, there's a definite disconnect, and I think it's because most golfers, because S&C isn't a force in golf, it's now increasingly becoming one, but for the longest time, golfers would hurt themselves, usually via overuse, and then they'd go see a physio, and then the physio would help rehab the injury. And then there'd be a vague suggestion maybe that, well, physical training can help prevent further injury. So, well, you seem to know what you're doing. Can you give me a physical training program? And now if you're a private physio, you're not going to turn down an opportunity to make some money, are you? So they'll write an intervention, and that intervention is usually physio oriented because you know what you know, right? So, and they end up with an intervention that includes, a lot of physio tools, often divorced from their original intent. So the Bosu ball is still a commonality in golf S&C, as is the Swiss ball, and doing things on top of these implements. And it very much smacks of, well, what's happened is a well-meaning physio has recommended something, and it's just bled into what is perceived to perhaps be performance training. Now, you talk to any strength and conditioning coach, they'll tell you that's not performance training. So I guess the commonalities lie when they want to build robust athletes. What an S&C coach defines as strong and robust is perhaps a little bit different to what a physio, is considered strong and robust. Both want return to play. They both want injury-free play. Obviously, S&C coach's specialization lies in, performance improvement. The physio's responsibility lies in injury prevention, but also prehab and rehab. And this is where the two absolutely need to talk to each other a lot more, because again, we don't want bad personal training being the endpoint of physio, right? At the same time, we don't want S&C coaches diagnosing or prescribing things to help deal with injury. I have my team at my place, and we refer back and forth constantly. My main physio, Alex, he's got an excellent bed to barbell mentality, in that we've got, he breaks out our physio bed in the middle of the gym, and he'll walk a person off the bed post-assessment into the rack, so there's that definite connection between the two things. And I feel that's sometimes where golf strength and conditioning has been, or the golf fitness, to use the term, is like over medicalized, again, obsessed with finding faults, obsessed with correct biomechanics, whereas perhaps we need a little more of that pragmatic sort of hands-on barbells, back slapping, let's get it done sort of mentality, not treating people like they're a medical case, and that bleeds into the robustness mindset as well, is that if people feel strong, they feel empowered, they're more likely to get the physical performance gains they're chasing. Whereas if you pathologize them, treat them like they're hurt or have the potential to be hurt, that bleeds into their thinking, and they start behaving differently. And then this is where, again, physios and S&C coaches working together can be big drivers of behavior change, but they've got to know obviously where the boundaries of each profession lies. And there are some guys that do both very, very well. I'm not saying they don't, but there's definitely that need for greater collaboration, better communication. And I'm seeing more physios now taking an active interest in strength and conditioning, which is great, but it does need to be, led by the right people, who can properly educate that process, because there's no point teaching physios how to do physios teaching physios how to do S&C, if you catch my meaning, which we do see some of at the moment.
Yeah. And you also, in your book and in some of your articles, you differentiate between like a physio-driven approach might work better for a recreational golfer than some of the golfers that you're working with.
Yeah.
You're working with these like elite developmental golfers who have structural adaptations, and they've been kind of refining their swing since a young age. So they can already get into key positions that, require to swing well. Whereas I practice in New York City. There aren't it's not a hotbed for golf talent. The golfers that I work with are like the, mid 40s to mid 50s person who is like a candidate for a hip replacement. They have like 5 degrees of thoracic rotation in both directions. So whereas the low hanging fruit for your golf athletes might be strength, for me, it's like you literally can't even move. So if I mobilize your thoracic spine, like that's probably going to improve your swing as much as working on vertical force production does for your golfers, because that's like the biggest area of need. And I'm not worried about like vertical power production because they can't even move, right?
No.
They can't even get into positions. So like in your experience, you know, for the higher level golfers, like how much of this dedicated, if they're not injured, mobility work and like physio based work do they really need? Like, are they really lacking some of these key positions, or is that something that's really more of an issue with the recreational golfer that maybe, you know, hasn't been doing it as long or isn't as athletic or young?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation because I guess a lot of golf fitness interventions are really for the recreational golfer.
Yeah.
I honestly, like, I know I'm not a fan of TPI, but you know, they seem to think that by using more sort of mobility oriented approaches and you know, your FMS, which again I'm not a massive fan of, you know, if you're a recreational golfer, chasing some of that stuff could be very, very useful for you. And it's a case with both sets of individuals, the recreational athlete or the professional, what's the lowest hanging fruit? Like what's the single physical quality that you can focus in on that you think will yield the biggest change? And again, you know, for that recreational person, you know, mobility is going to be a massive driver of performance improvement. For professional golfers who the mobility message has gotten through, we've done some research where we've looked at behaviors. Most of those guys all mobilize, they foam roll, they stretch, they know that it's important. They may not know why, but they know that it's important. They're doing it. So what's the next biggest way we can impact their performance? Well, it's coming back to that strength mass argument that these are the two things, because most of the time, if you're playing professional golf, your mobility is probably already pretty good. You know, if you're playing off scratch, you move well, you know. But the thing is, the idea is you come in with this sort of surgical mindset was, oh, well, you know, maybe there are some faults we can fix. And that's the wrong approach for the pros quite often, you know, because again, if they're moving well, movement is not the problem. And there's this disconnect. You're playing pro golf at a European tour, challenge tour, PGA, or some of the feeder tours, you probably move excellently. Then why let movement be an issue? You know, it's only a problem when it becomes a problem, right? So, you know, if the athlete comes in complaining of X stuff is limiting my swing, then you can work on that acutely. But for the most of the time, it's never a problem. But it seems to be, again, people conflate recreational and professional interventions. And that's a big problem, I think, for a lot of guys is that they'll work with maybe a couple of pros, but then they'll work with a lot of recreational guys and the practice bleeds over a little bit. Maybe they don't mean it intentionally, but, you know, it's well-meaning, but mainly because of the lack of understanding of proper strength and conditioning. So they're just going to conform to type. They're just going to, you know, do the mobility stuff they always do with everybody. They just end up doing it with pros as well. And this is where, you know, again, I think people just perhaps not aware of the end of their understanding. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate, but you know, yeah, there is this definite obsession with mobility. You know, that seems kind of pointless.
Yeah, and I mean, for you, when you get a new golfer, new athlete into your gym, are there what if anything are you formally assessing? I mean, like if somebody asked me that question, I kind of give like the Dan Path answer, which is the training, like is the movement screen, so to speak. And like, you know, I have no reservations about saying that because I'm not going to like pretend I do this really fancy assessment just to do it. So are there things that like you take away, you know, from training time to formally assess?
Yeah, so we'll have those two KPIs we'll assess. Isometric mid-thigh pull, counter movement jump impulse are the two big ones. We'll assess those mainly just from an objectivity standpoint. That so we can track improvement over time. But in terms of like movement assessment, most of the time, once I get them moving and lifting, warm up is one of the key things, you know. And then if there is an issue, I'm not afraid to get someone on the bed and look at their, you know, internal, external rotation. It just depends on what the situation calls for. Right. You know, my head physio, Alex, runs a pretty good screen. And like we had a guy on the other day, the screen took about 5 minutes, probably less than that. And he goes, there's nothing worth saying anything. Because there's no point pathologizing something that isn't there. You know, there was
that's refreshing to hear.
yeah. So it took less than 5 minutes. He goes, well, he's a perfectly healthy athlete. Then we went straight on to doing our mid-thigh pull and our counter movement jump. And we spent more time focusing on those because those are areas of importance to this guy, because again, I think the responsibility of a physio in particular is to make sure they don't make an issue out of something that isn't an issue, particularly in a population that's prone to obsessing over minutia. If you tell someone, your external rotation of the hip on one side is not as good as the other, they're an asymmetrical athlete. Of course it's going to be like that, so you can make athletes obsess over things that aren't really worth obsessing about. Asymmetries, particularly in the golf population, are very normal. It's only a problem when it's a problem. You got a professional golfer, they can swing well, they present with asymmetries, then if as long as they're not hurt or it's not affecting their performance, then why worry about it? And again, I think you're looking at the potential for continued income stream, stuff like that, or it's like, well, we should probably fix X, and then that becomes an opportunity to keep selling to the individual. And don't get me wrong, working privately, there are some people that are perhaps somewhat unethical or don't have particularly great scruples who will keep looking for an opportunity to keep making money for an athlete, and that's something we don't talk about a lot in the private sphere, because it's such a taboo around that type of behavior. We don't call it out often enough, I think, maybe.
Yeah, well, I definitely I appreciate the somewhat contrarian perspective when it comes to golf, because this is probably not what people expected to hear. And you've got, I would encourage everybody to dive deeper into some of your resources. So can you talk about, where people can find you on social media and the new product that you're releasing? The big
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram, which is where I used to blog an awful lot, but blogging seems to have died a death, so I don't do that so much anymore. But you can find me on Instagram. That's where most of my content goes now, and that's at Powering Through, all one word. I do have a website, which is powering-through.com. The blog gets updated occasionally. If you just want to know more about me and my team, you can always go there. I'm on Twitter, at WS Wayland. You can find me there. And much more recently, we've just released the Big Hitters Manual, which is basically an introduction to strength training for gaining mass and gaining strength for golfers looking to get into that type of training. There's not a lot of special strength stuff in there. It's very much what we're referring to meat and potatoes type training. That's the idea, because this is where we want guys to get on board, is with the basics, because so many guys still don't do that. So you can get the Big Hitters Manual. That's by me and Terrence Kennel, and that's available if you go to my website. That's available in the shop from the store there. We put some time into it, and we're pretty proud of it. So people are already asking about maybe a second volume where we focus more on some of the swing strategy stuff and the speed stuff. But we'll let people digest the first one first. So
All right. Well, I'll post the notes for all that stuff. Appreciate your time, and if you ever do write that, the second edition, then we'll be sure to have you back on.
Sure.
All right. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on all products at resilientperformance.com. Please use promo code PODCAST at checkout. That's PODCAST. And I also encourage you to sign up for our mailing list to receive exclusive articles only available by signing up. Thanks for listening.